Welcome to Velina's talk on the strategy of denial. The topic of our discussion today is, in fact, the title of the book of Elbridge Colby. The book was released last year, and my guest today is co-founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a policy initiative focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. He's the author of this really excellent book we are going to talk about a little bit later, released by Yale University Press in September 2021, which the Wall Street Journal selected as one of the top 10 books of 2021. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development between 2017 through 2018, during which he led the development of the 2018 National Defense Strategy. Welcome to my digital talk.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Velina. Really a pleasure.
So this digital talk takes place in cooperation with Bharat Varta, one of India's leading podcast producers in Politics Society. And today's topic is very much dedicated to the American geopolitics and, of course, the future American defense strategy. So first question to you, dear Bridge, is actually, what are the fundamental geopolitical goals and, of course, premises of the American grand strategy in the 21st century? What is your assessment also? Would you actually also update or add something, given that the book was published last year and given also your work for the 2018 National Defense Strategy?
Well, great. Really wonderful to be with you, Velina. You're such an important and visionary thinker. So it's a real pleasure to be on with you and your listeners. I guess my clarifying question would be, are you asking for my assessment of what America's grand strategy actually is, or what it should be?
First, the state of arts as of now, of course, and then your recommendation, your normative assessment as how it should be.
So I think we are in a transitional phase. I mean, the fundamental reality is the fact that we no longer have the sort of super abundance of power, certainly military power, but also economic power that we thought we may have enjoyed in the years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, so over the last generation, so that we can't handle all the potential threats essentially on our own with sort of relatively modest contributions from a few of our allies like the United Kingdom and Australia. That world is gone. I think there is a definitely that recognition has begun to sink in. It is becoming internalized, but there's sort of a stages of grief phenomenon going on right now where people just kind of can't, especially sort of especially older people in their many older people who are in positions of influence, including the President of the United States. And they kind of find it very hard, I think, to let that sort of the world of unipolarity go. I'll say this: I think where we need to go is a very strict focus on China and Asia, because that's what is most important to Americans' interests. Obviously, we want to think about our interests in an enlightened way, but I paraphrase a Henry Kissinger joke. He says that only in America is being a realist an epithet, although maybe in post Cold War Europe too. But I adjust that a little bit. Only in America is it considered an epithet to say that you're looking after Americans' interests in the world. But that's what we need to do. We need to be much more clearly and concretely connected. And by far the most significant challenge to Americans' interests in the world is the potential for China to dominate the world's largest market area. China is the largest other state in the international system. It's the only other superpower. And Asia is by far the world's largest market area. And if China could attain a dominance over that area, it would have enormous ramifications, of course, for Europe as well, but for Americans' lives as well. We need to ensure that we prevent that from happening, and only we can do it. We don't have the power, unfortunately, anymore to do that and kind of bestride the world like a colossus, like the way we thought we did 25 years ago. Those days are gone. Unfortunately, I don't think that the current administration is fully embraced this. I think there are elements of the administration that recognize this problem, particularly in the Pentagon, maybe some in the National Security Council. But I think their behavior and their response to the Russian threat to Ukraine, as well as the indications in the Middle East, suggest that they do not appreciate fully the need to focus, and also more fully the need to prioritize our hard power, and particularly our military position in the Pacific. I think the administration today has a fundamentally different theory of the case. I'm happy to get into that I think is fallacious, is erroneous, and will not serve us well, because we do really need to prioritize, and we'll need to draw down our commitments in other theaters, especially our military commitments, including in Europe.
But what would be your recommendation in normative terms? What could be done better? I mean, you're implying, of course, that this kind of global power capabilities need probably to be focused more on the Eastern Asian terrain, right? Because when you say Asia, you don't mean all of it, the Eurasian landmass, and then South Asia, where United States have basically, by the withdrawal from Afghanistan, refrained from a military footprint, right? With the power projection towards Central Asia as of now. So you probably mean, what exactly do you mean?
I mean the first island chain. No, you're exactly right. I mean, the model is that the key theater, and I'm of the view that, as Churchill put it, and Churchill changed his positions on lots of things, but I think he was right about this. He said, if you get things right in the decisive theater, then you can put things right everywhere else afterwards. So if you get things, and that's why we had a Europe first policy in World War II. We didn't perfectly implement it because we were so much more powerful along with our allies than Nazi Germany, but and the Axis. But that was our strategy. Even though the Japanese had attacked us, that was the correct assessment. The critical theater of the world is particularly East Asia, because Asia writ large is the world's largest geoeconomic area, but the critical theater for Asia will be East and Southeast Asia, because that's where Chinese power projection is most concentrated, and where the most sophisticated Asian economies are, and where the linchpin of the U.S.-led anti-hegemonic coalition is going to be Japan and South Korea, as well as Australia. But unfortunately, the situation is very grave there, because the Chinese have developed not only an anti-access area denial military, but also increasingly a power projection military designed to first subordinate Taiwan, but then, as necessary, intimidate other countries, and if necessary, subordinate other countries into, sort of accepting China's hegemony. So the United States needs to hold the line at the first island chain, which is to say Japan, Taiwan, Philippines line, which has been our line, because the thing about the Pacific is it's very large, but almost all of the wealth is concentrated on the western edge. If we hold Yap and Truk and Kwajalein, and the Chinese are able to subordinate Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, that's not a winning proposition for us. So the military situation is very severe, and what we need is a military strategy of denial, and that's a high standard, because we need to be able to defeat a conventional invasion of, say, Taiwan by the Chinese. We cannot rely on horizontal escalation or any of these kind of harebrained ideas. At the same time, that gives us there's a logical way of looking at South Asia, and I know there's a lot of Indian listeners here. South Asia is critical importance essentially because of India, but India is a autonomous power. And I wrote a piece in the Hindustan Times last weekend, kind of laying out basically my idea, which is a division of labor model. I mean, it's pretty intuitive, but India doesn't want to be in an alliance. It's still got the non-aligned element. Great. We should enable India to stand up and be the leader in South Asia. We will draw down, obviously, we withdrew from Afghanistan, focus on the first island chain, and actually a similar model is what we should pursue in Europe, where NATO should and the Scandinavians should stand up and do something, become more like the Indians, who are appropriate model. But I don't see this happening to the degree that is necessary. So it's not so much that there is outright resistance that's politically meaningful in the United States to the shift, but rather the degree and urgency that's required. But of course, as Shakespeare said, for want of a shoe, the kingdom was lost. Especially in a limited or conventional war, or a war that might involve limited nuclear exchanges, God forbid, relatively narrow margins can lead to outsized effects. And I mean, I think, you're obviously a great student of history. limited, it's still relatively large, but limited wars can have enormous geopolitical consequences. I mean, the example that I'd like to point to that probably most resonates with what I think the most dangerous Chinese strategy is the wars of German unification, where Berlin was able to fight three, by European standards, relatively smaller, medium-sized wars that ultimately had dramatic geopolitical consequences. I mean, really fundamental, that we all lived with for over a century. Similarly, I mean, the geopolitical situation less, but I mean, the German invasion of Western Europe in 1940, I mean, it was a near-run thing, probably in the Ardennes, but the results were not. So we can't screw around, is my view. We can't spread the peanut butter. And John Kirby, the press secretary, said yesterday in response to some questions, well, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And that's what sets off my alarm bells. It's an American expression that means, oh, I can walk and I'm also chewing gum. I can do two things at the same time. Oh, it's not a big deal. Wrong attitude. The situation is very severe in Asia. We have not reformed as much as we needed. And so now we're in a serious, grave situation. And yet we're reacting to the situation in Europe in a way that suggests business as usual, unfortunately.
Well, in order to have the best American strategy in defense terms, right? The best US defense strategy, it needs to be a response to also the threats, risks, and well, the whole kind of geopolitical and geoeconomic situation. You've outlined already more or less a number of problems, but let's unpack it a little bit. Do you think that China is en route to actually launching simultaneously both a rimland strategy this of course is related mostly to the activities in the South China Sea, the Strait of Taiwan, the Indo-Pacific realm, also with the strings of pearls surrounding and containing India, trying to get an access to the Indian Ocean or from both sides, Myanmar and Pakistan, with the economic corridors, but at the very same time also trying to actually apply heartland strategy in the wider Eurasian landmass. Basically, given that United States will further pursue a rimland approach, United States is this most successful example in the modern history as a rimland geopolitical power, right? Now also engaging alliances and partnerships in the East Asian realm, take the security and defense pact with UK and Australia into consideration. Do you think that this might become also a big problem for the US defense strategy if the combination of the both is ignored, if there is only the one side of the equation being tackled as you've outlined, but then of course there is no possibility to currently to deal with the other side of the coin? I mean, the United States does not have a military footprint in Central Asia, has more or less was cut off also from a possible access through the South Asian, terrain, take Afghanistan, take Iran, now also under Chinese influence. And if India does not enter a security and defense pact with the United States in the long term, where United States can also put military boots on the ground, let's put it that way, how would you actually deal with this comprehensive approach that I think China is currently trying to actually apply in global affairs?
Well, our concern is really the rimland, because that's obviously we're in the world island, we're a maritime power, we're essentially an insular power, and most of the wealth that we need to if we think about it in reductive terms, the wealth that we need to agglomerate to ensure a sufficient anti-hegemonic coalition that will prevent China from dominating Asia can be assembled from the rimland areas. So, of course, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, potentially some of the Southeast Asian states like Vietnam, although TBD, and then some ancillary help, particularly in the economic area, from strong allies like the United Kingdom and others. The heartland is Russia's problem. I mean, from our point of view, I actually think it's good that we're out of Central Asia, because now the China, and now they've been able to concentrate on the Russians have done them the favor of allowing the Chinese to concentrate their military development on power projection in the maritime sphere, which we need to compensate for. But given Russia's behavior and decisions in recent years, I don't think we're going to be trying to solve any of Russia's problems, and vice versa. Obviously, they're exacerbating our problems quite happily right now, it looks like. So if anything, it's probably a good thing that they're operated. Now, the Russians and the Chinese appear to have some kind of sufficient accommodation or condominium that they can work out. So the Russian intervention in Kazakhstan a week or two ago. But I mean, the Russians are nothing if not realists. China's becoming much, much richer and more powerful than Russia. Yes, it's building a navy, but it also has a very significant army and air force. And those capabilities can be turned anywhere. It's just a matter of intent, and intent is changeable. And of course, it has enormous economic investments through Belt and Road that are relevant in Central Asia. So, we're going to worry about the rimlands, and India is critical. I don't think we need a formal alliance. In fact, I don't think either of us actually wants a formal alliance. India doesn't want an alliance because it doesn't want to be bossed around. It wants to take care, which I respect. In fact, I laud that. And we don't want an alliance because most of our allies are free riders. So, we want countries that put their skin into it, put their shoulder into it, I should say. And India is a great example of that. And they don't do it for our sake. They do it for their own sake. Perfect. So we should help them. Our interests are aligned, and they will be for the foreseeable future, because, we both share a primary threat. The Indian chief of defense, before he had that untimely passing, he identified China as their biggest threat. And this is, I think you'll appreciate, I think this is an error in Russia's assessment of the future geopolitical environment. I mean, I don't want to sound presumptuous to judge Russians' own perception of their foreign policy, but my impression is the Russians believe the world is becoming more multipolar, and that will give them greater space to operate. But I think this is a misassessment. I think the world will be largely bipolar, particularly in the kind of eastern 2/3 of Eurasia, because the gravitational force that China exerts will kind of put countries in one direction or another. And India is a perfect example. I mean, we're not, Americans like to talk about shared values and all that stuff, but look, I mean, India and the United States are bound together by shared fear, which is the most reliable form of foreign policy, which is of China dominating Asia. And similarly with Japan. And I think ultimately South Korea will come along. They certainly should. So I think we will have a very good relationship. It will continue to grow. I mean, the Americans would be stupid to sanction India, of course, which I don't put it past us, because we do stupid things with disturbing regularity. But that's, that I'm trying to help change that. But I think, I think if, if China pursues internally, and I doubt they can resist the urge. They have, there's going to be economic interest. There's going to be political interest. They're hopefully going to find a pretty formidable, hopefully very formidable defense capability along the first island chain. The Japanese are finally getting religion. They need to do more, but that's going to create problems for China's other neighbors, and ultimately Russia. I doubt that Russia will want to just rely on Beijing's tender mercies over time. And the power balance, of course, is going to be lopsided in China's favor. So Russia's going to need to have other options.
You've spoken at the beginning about the strategy of denial. Can you give some concrete examples of the strategy of denial for our viewers and listeners derived from your book? Also, you mentioned Taiwan. Do you foresee actually a direct military attack by China against Taiwan in this decade, or do you think that it's going to all this kind of penetration and also threats will be kept under the level of a kinetic warfare, so to say, when it comes to Taiwan?
Sure. Yeah. So denial. I mean, Clausewitz said the military object should always have the political object in mind. Any military action to be rational should have the political object in mind. So, I mean, A defense strategy is ultimately, to be sensible and rational, should pursue some political objective. And the political objective is one of denial, which is denial of any state the ability to dominate one of the world's key regions. And the fact of the matter is that world productivity is concentrated in a few areas. I mean, if you look at a map of GDP kind of concentrations, basically East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia to some extent, it's growing. Europe, largely in the kind of Western and Central areas, and then North America itself. Those are the places that matters a little bit in South America, a little bit in the Persian Gulf, but those places are basically, everything else is going to, the fate of the rest of the world will be determined by those, because those areas are so productive that they could generate and sustain large military forces and other forms of power to work their will on the rest of the world. And so that we need to make sure that those, and by far the most important of those, as I said, is Asia. So our goal needs to be to deny that of Asia. Europe is, Borrell himself said that Europe is going to decline from 20% to about 25 or so percent to 20%, 10%, excuse me, from 25 to 10% of global GDP in the next 20 years. So, I mean, Europe is important, but it's a lot less important than Asia. So that's the ultimate goal, is, okay, deny. And that's a negative goal, which is good, because, I never was a fan of, the George W. Bush approach or the Madeleine Albright kind of thing, which is that we need to have, imprint our way on the world for a variety of reasons, and their imprudence is a sufficient conviction of that view, I think. But, the basic goal, I think the enduring goal and the rational, reasonable goal for American foreign policy is to deny, some other state, whatever its complexion. Obviously, it's worse when it's a Marxist-Leninist dictatorship, but I don't want any state to be so powerful that it can kind of intrude into our national life and undermine our freedoms, which is the purpose of our country. And so that's the goal. Denial in the second sense is a military form of denial. So what is the military strategy that's required to substantiate that political strategy? Well, we need to think then about what China's strategy is. Basically, it's a coalition model. It's classic balance of power. Okay, you got a guy who may take over the place. You get a couple of people together, whether they're your old friends or not. I mean, Vietnam, we fought a horrible war with, but now our interests are aligned. Get them together, work together, and you stop this big guy from taking over the place. Okay, that's kind of happening, which is good. But China, of course, has an approach, and this is where the Bismarck analogy becomes relevant. Is, I think, the danger here is that China would pursue what I think of as a focused and sequential strategy, basically a series of short, or potentially short, but kind of limited, sharp wars designed to collapse the coalition, because China wants to avoid, rationally, I would imagine, wants to avoid what Hitler did, which is declare war on everybody, and then ultimately you shoot yourself in a bunker. Not what China wants. Instead, if China can fight a couple of short, sharp wars, it might be able to collapse that coalition, particularly by showing that the United States, which must, by dint of our size, play the leading role in Asia, then it can get the results, those dramatic geopolitical benefits and geoeconomic, for relatively limited investment of military force. And so I think that's what we need to prepare for. And the key then is to deny China its ability to bring that degree of successful pressure on our allies within the coalition, particularly, because that's the ones who are, our word is connected to. So obviously Japan, South Korea, Australia, Philippines, but also Taiwan, which I basically treat as essentially an ally. I think at this point it's pretty clear. And denial means that we need to deny China's ability to generate that degree of leverage that's required to get Taiwan to give up and basically go over. And that's a contextual and relative standard, and that gets to your last question. And I think actually that Taiwan is very unlikely, and almost impossible to imagine Taiwan giving up, short of military force, because nobody on Taiwan wants to give up their hard-earned freedoms to live under Xi Jinping, be sent to re-education camps, and have all your social media, everything on your phone monitored, and what you say to your wife and all that. So nobody wants that. And in fact, China's strategy to pursue that has probably not only failed, but probably been counterproductive over the last 20 years. I mean, the Sunflower Movement in Taiwan back in 2016 was a sort of a taste of that. And then, of course, China completely blew up its credibility that it could be believed as a, peaceful unification by what it's done in Hong Kong. I mean, you'd have to be an idiot to believe that China will honor its political commitments, because they completely violated them in Hong Kong, which was even like an internationalized commitment. So people on Taiwan aren't stupid, so nobody wants that. China knows that too. which is, I think, why China is increasingly looking to military instruments. And there, I think in reality, when you really just boil it down, China would have to invade and occupy the country because, you know, as Napoleon said, apropos of where you are, if you want Vienna, take Vienna, you know, don't mess around. Like, you know, George W. Bush, I think wrongly, but George W. Bush wanted Saddam Hussein to give up his WMD, alleged WMD. Well, okay, go to Baghdad. Bad idea, but that's how he got the leverage. And, you know, there isn't going to be this kind of ninja sort of clever move, cyber attacks and all this kind of song and dance. No, if they're going to do it to Taiwan, they're going to have to use very serious military force. And I think if I were in Beijing, I wouldn't mess around with a blockade that could get out of hand. I don't know how that's going to go. I would just go. And they're building the military to do it. They're building air assault forces, of course. They have some areas of their amphibious capability that apparently are still lacking, but could probably be plugged in a relatively short amount of time. And of course, Admiral Davidson famously said last year that, you know, by 2027 at latest, they'll probably have the capability. So it's you know, and Mao Zedong wanted to take Taiwan back. It wasn't for lack of will, it was for lack of capability. But now they're going to be pretty close to that. I think we're already in the window where they might have the capability. Who knows? But it's definitely possible.
Okay, obviously no military attack. I agree with you actually that it makes little sense for Xi Jinping to actually try to attack Taiwan militarily because of the unforeseen second order of events and effects that such attack might have actually on his domestic leverage. I mean, trying to also deal with all the repercussions from the pandemic, now trying to also solidify his power ahead of the very important, Congress of the Communist Party, trying to also remove political opponents. But I do think that one potential risk where we should be aware of is actually this long-term penetration of the social fabric of the political process, infiltration of different interest groups, trying to undermine the political and social, fabric of the Taiwan, because there of course they have already the good example from Hong Kong. You've seen how efficient, actually how quick and efficient they took Hong Kong under control. And there, of course, defense strategy would not be, the right way how to approach this. And do you think that, because you also mentioned free riders, and currently we are also in a situation where there are a lot of fluid geopolitical alliances and partnerships, and in fact, in Asia, specifically in East Asia, there are new formations. Like, take the example of Australia. Even though that Australia had a strong geo-economic relationship with China, they took a side. Even though that they were trying to balance between Washington and Beijing, they were trying to, navigate and take the benefits from both partnerships. They took a side. Do you think that other Eastern Asian and specifically Indo-Pacific partners will at some point be confronted with a either or choice, where they have to take a side, and whether Taiwan won't be this kind of trigger for that when they see that things are really getting serious? As I said, under the radar of a direct military attack, you have a full spectrum of all other possibilities that China will, I think, explore and try to apply on Taiwan in order to, weaken Taiwan and set an example, specifically, as you said, because China is also having its strategy of denial, right? Trying to deny Taiwan the opportunity also to reach out to partners of United States. Take the example now with Europe as well. Lithuania, Slovenia, trying also to engage with Taiwan and to, to create a political, negative scenario for China. I mean, creating a negative image on China's economic interests. A very broad spectrum, but I think that this is something that we need to anticipate for this decade when we talk about the American response?
So I think I have a somewhat different view. I think that military action and invasion are much more plausible than I think you do. And I think the basic reason is because I think the vast sort of range of things that you're talking about won't work for China. And I think China already knows. In fact, Australia is a perfect example. They have enormous economic leverage over Australia, and the result of what they've been trying to turn that economic leverage into political results has backfired dramatically. I mean, and something similar with India. And in fact, their use of economic sanctions against Japan and Taiwan and elsewhere has largely backfired and definitely not turned into economic political results. So I'm actually not that worried. And this has a little bit of a paradoxical effect. So I tend to be more sanguine about trade with China, but much more worried about the military balance than I would say the conventional wisdom. Because I think, look, our experience is that economic sanctions, even pretty severe economic sanctions, are very limited in their efficacy. I mean, look, we've had an embargo on Cuba for over 60 years for almost nothing to show for it. We've sanctioned North Korea. Obviously, we sanctioned Vietnam, North Vietnam. Even Iran, we've had difficulty, and that's on a relatively narrow ask. We're not talking about what would be at issue, say, over Taiwan would be full-scale capitulation, would be total surrender. And embargoes almost never work. Blockades never work. The Germans tried it on Britain. I mean, yes, Britain was resolute, and that's actually why I think it's actually kind of hard to find examples of blockades, mostly because when somebody is powerful enough to pull off a blockade, they just invade because it's easier, and it's more reliable. So that should give us some comfort, but because it means that, I mean, the Chinese cut off pineapple imports from Taiwan recently, and I think it's basically backfired. I mean, Tsai Ing-wen got decisively reelected. So I'm not so worried about that. But what it does mean is that, I mean, it's something to pay attention to. But I think we're going to have some selective decoupling model. But what it does mean is that the military option is much more attractive. Now, Hong Kong has happened the way it is, and I use this idea in my book, this idea of imagined wars. When Margaret Thatcher wanted to keep Hong Kong, but Deng Xiaoping was like, forget about it. And the reason why was because the imagined wars, because the United Kingdom fully understood that it would get completely smoked by the PRC, even in 1984, let alone today. I mean, the reality is simply that China occupied Hong Kong. It was already an occupied territory. They were just voluntarily not imposing their will, which they then violated their agreement. So, Kowloon is part of the mainland. Hong Kong, I guess, like probably a mile off the mainland or something. Taiwan is different. Taiwan is 100 miles from the Chinese mainland, obviously not the offshore islands, but they don't really matter. So, so I think this is a much different situation. China would need to first impose its will militarily. And so I do think that's more probable. In terms of Xi's own, political incentives, one way or the other, I don't know which way those cut. Sometimes people make the wag the dog argument that maybe he'll want to try to start a war to distract from domestic problems. But then you could say that maybe sometimes people don't want to get in a foreign war. Personally, I think it tends to be kind of a wash. So I don't know. I mean, one thing that does, though, about Xi Jinping is we can see that he's committed, he's resolute, and he's a tough guy. I mean, the guy grew up in a cave, for 5 years. His father was purged, yet he's remained loyal to the party. We know he cares about Taiwan. He's communicating that. He said to the PLA the other day, I want you to be prepared for an actual war. Like, that's not what the Italian prime minister is telling the Italian military. Like that's something different, So I'm quite worried. And then I think your last question was it was something about, I'm forgetting. Sorry, but hopefully that's enough. But there was a lot in there.
That is enough for now, because we have to unpack a lot more. I mean, you already outlined actually so many. You gave us already so much food for thought, and I'm seeing also that questions are coming in the chat. But first, I would like to ask to go back to India and then also address the issues we are experiencing and witnessing in Europe. I argue in the case of India, I personally argue that India will not be in the luxury situation of pursuing another non-alignment policy during Cold War 2.0 during another great power competition, as it did in the competition between the Soviet Union and United States. So I think that at some point, and given the different reality right now, given the fact that now there is a geopolitical and geoeconomic rapprochement between Pakistan and China, which is completely blocking basically the access of India towards Central Asia, and then trying, to come up with its own connectivity projects that also connects India with Central Asia and Russia. I do think that they will have to take a decision this time. They will have to actually align with the United States, and it will be a United States, won't be Russia, to support India in the case of a direct military conflict with China, because Russia will be doing what it has always done, supporting both sides, sending arms to both sides. This was the case with the last military tension. So I would like to hear your opinion on that. I mean, do you foresee a situation where there will, maybe it's not going to be called an alliance? You've said already, probably this will be a different kind of alliances, but where we will see a clear defense cooperation. The trend is already positive, but clear defense cooperation where we will see American military presence on the ground in order to actually counter the Chinese increasing influence. What is your take on that?
Yeah. Well, the only part I thoroughly agree, except for the part about American boots on the ground. We don't need American boots on the ground except to help, kind of like contractors and helping. I mean, basically, in the standards of, say, pre-1914 language, I think the United States and India are already allies. I mean, we're closer than Britain and France were in 1913, but absolutely our strategic interests are fully aligned. And when I talk to senior Indian officials or hear from senior Indian officials and officers, and this is why, they have high respect and I would say fear of what the Chinese are capable of, and they're right to do so. I mean, the fundamental fact is that India has grown. It's one of the most important countries in the world. So it's more important and more relevant in a way that it wasn't in the Cold War, when it really was a kind of a tertiary theater in South Asia. India now is one of the top 4 economies in the world, but it's a lot behind China. 20 years ago, they were a lot closer, but China's grown a lot faster. Now, who knows what the future will hold? But for the medium term, for the next decade or two, that's pretty much locked in. So India needs help. And this is what Russia's not strong enough. And Russia's in a terrible fight with the Americans and the Europeans. So it's going to be afraid of fully angering China. So obviously Russia's not going to be there in a way to help India enough. Now, I'm not saying anything about the military relationship and the arms issue, whatever, but I just mean at a geopolitical level. The only country that can really help India is America. Well, and our interest is also in having India be part of this anti-hegemonic coalition. And this is not an Asian NATO. Actually, frankly, if I were recreating NATO, I probably would create it in a very different way, because it's a ton of political overhead for actually relatively little military output. Most of the European states are free riders. It's actually not irrational. It's pretty rational from their point of view, but it doesn't work anymore. So India is the opposite of a free rider. India is like, go take a hike, America. We're going to do this by ourselves. I'm like, great. That's awesome. Love that. Same with Vietnam and Israel. That's the kind of model. The South Koreans actually do a good job at, despite being a U.S. ally. But, our biggest problem in a way right now is Japan, Taiwan, and Germany, the 3 close allies that, are causing enormous problems for us and many others because they're not pulling their weight. Now, the Japanese and the Taiwans are slowly improving, but Germany remains a huge problem, which will only get more severe and could lead to a genuine crisis if this continues. But India, I think, we're headed for a beautiful future together. Again, yes, we're both democracies. Yes, there's lots of Indians in America and so forth, but it's really bound together by our shared concern, and more than concern, fear of China. So I think, but what I would see this as being about, and the way I lay it out in the Hindustan Times, was a division of labor, that India really obviously handles its own defense, but also South Asia. So, I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago when there was a flare up with Pakistan, and all of these Americans were wringing their hands and saying, we need to mediate between India and Pakistan. I said, no, we take India's side. Pakistan is small potatoes compared to the, and Pakistan's made it bed with China, which is not surprising. I mean, in a sense, what's happened is we've flipped alignments, right? In the Cold War, it was us with Pakistan, Thailand, communist China, against the Soviet Union. And now our problem is different. It's China. So we're with India and not Pakistan. We're with Vietnam and not Cambodia. At some point in the future, ideally, we would have Russia involved in some way, probably informally, not a full alignment. And we're not gonna overpay for it. But at some point, that's gonna, and that's where the Indian relationship with Russia may come in handy over time, is because, at some point, we are going to need a reverse Nixon to China, or maybe they send their, maybe it's Brezhnev to Washington. I don't know. But just looking at it from a structural geopolitical point of view, doesn't make a lot of sense. So, and if something doesn't make a lot of sense, it'll probably change at some point, but it matters when and how.
And you actually pointed to one of the most sensitive issues. That is the issue of a possible American retreat from Europe, because as you pointed out, Europe is currently in a situation where it's shrinking in terms of true economic clout, share of global GDP, aging population, no skin in the game, talking the talk, but never walking the walk, not even capable of actually securing its own direct vicinity to the south and to the east. Just to give the example, from a strategy of ring of friends and basically promoting stability, security, and prosperity in the direct neighborhood. This is the European security strategy from 2003. We are now in a situation 20 years later, because I've been following these debates for the last 20 years, and even longer, we are now in the situation of a complete ring of fire, not being able to actually prevent any of the military conflicts or direct tensions to the south. I mean, take the whole MENA region into consideration. And of course, what we've been observing now with the relaunched military escalation, because since 2014, we've been in a perpetual state of imminent military attack or reinvasion or incursions or separatist movements, or take also the frozen conflicts into consideration. So basically, the whole periphery of Europe, except for Great Britain, which now exited, and to the north, we are going to face also an increasing tension coming from China and Russia, of course, in a coordinated manner, to control also the Arctic at some point of time, because there will be probably in 10 or 20 years from now also the opportunity for an alternative maritime route that would bypass the US-controlled maritime routes in the Indo-Pacific, right? So do Europeans realize that there is going to be an American retreat, no matter how this episode is going to be solved right now, that there is a systemic layer to what Putin has considered doing starting with December last year, which is being ignored in the European capitals, and that is that, in fact, the Russian president is trying to already upgrade Russia's position in the long game, in the systemic competition, trying to present Russia as this indispensable player that none of both systemic rivals can actually ignore if they want to win the systemic competition. So nobody wants Russia, but nobody can actually accept that Russia is part of the rivals bloc. So this kind of logic, right? Not because of the positive appeal, but because of the realities on the ground. Do Europeans realize that what needs to happen in the European capitals in order for them to realize that there's going to be an American retreat, whether we like it or not, that America is going to move towards East Asia and the Indo-Pacific, as you've outlined that? And what role do you foresee for European powers, probably Great Britain, France to some extent? Germany is completely missing in this equation. If they want to still play a geopolitical role in the 21st century, what needs to be changed?
Well, more than a geopolitical role if they want to be secure. I mean, look, let's start out. I mean, you and I were talking before. I mean, I think that if you have a friend who has a serious medical condition, are you a better friend if you just help this person ignore the doctor's advice? Maybe they have cancer or they have heart disease. And you say, don't worry about it, just ignore it, like just enjoy life, you know? Is that a better friend? Or is it a better friend to be like, Bob, you got to take what your doctor said seriously. Let's look at it now. I'm going to help you. I'm going to work with you. I can't do everything for you. It's the medical conditions for you, but we got to grapple with it. To me, I would want the latter. I would want a friend who cared about me and my well-being, right? This is the logic that I take. And I think the people who do the other way are actually hurting their friends. And this is the take that is too ascendant in Washington. It is also not uncommon among Republicans, but it's particularly pronounced from the current administration. The fundamental reality of the world is, I mean, you and I can see it. We can all see it. It's pretty simple at the end of the day. China's huge. It's huge. It's like another Jupiter. For the first time in 150 years, we are not the world's largest economy by far and away. And people, it's a mystery to me because people still act in Europe like, oh yeah, China's a big, it's not really that, it's kind of the implication, it's not really that dangerous or important, or Asia's, obviously Europe, the transatlantic bond, we all know is still the most, and it's like, no, I'm thinking about Americans' interests, and Americans' interests are going to be where most of the money is, where the market is, and that's Asia, and that's China. And anyone who's been to China will be impressed at what they've been able to do. I mean, I don't like communism, to say the least. I hate it, actually. But you cannot deny what the Chinese have done. I mean, the Chinese people, despite the Communist Party in most respects, but under the governance of the Chinese Communist Party, particularly under Deng Xiaoping, it's extraordinary. And if you look at their neighbors, it doesn't take, you don't have to be some, PhD economist to see. It's like, well, the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Taiwans, their neighbors who are, cut from the same cloth, basically, in the grand scheme of things, they're very rich. So, yeah, maybe the Chinese economy will hit some, turbulence or slow down, but, they're likely to probably be pretty much at the highest level of world economic development, which is where Asia was until about the 16th century. So, okay, that's the reality. Europe is a lot smaller. America, as I said before, this cornerstone balancer idea, we play a vital role in Asia that only we can play. Not even Japan and India are remotely strong enough to take on China without the United States in some way. And, okay, so our economy is about the same size. It's going to be smaller by a lot of metrics, especially if there's pressure on the dollar. We're not increasing the defense budget. This administration isn't increasing the defense budget. And by the way, most of our defense budget goes to kind of, perpetuating the status quo. I mean, most differences, we have a very large army, most of which is stationed in the United States to defend against Mexico. I don't know. I mean, and it's not like we can just move it all to Europe, because it would need all kinds of enablers and logistics and ships and aircraft that we don't have. So, and we're not going to buy. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So that means we have scarcity. And in a condition of scarcity, we're going to focus on Asia. Okay, well, the situation is very severe over Taiwan. You have uniformed officials saying we're on track to lose, which is pretty rare. I mean, and people are kind of acting like, oh, yeah, well, we're handling it. No, that's a huge problem. And so that's the reality. We're going to shift to Asia. So there's two questions. There's two options. One is to shift. We already passed the point where we could do it very gracefully and all that. But one is the path to do it, at least with some integration with the Europeans and some warning and taking time. But that requires being frank with the Europeans. Like, we're not going to be here. It's not 1999 anymore. You guys really need to do it. Like, no, I'm serious. I'm not joking, right? The other one is that we ignore the problem and we continue doing what we used to be doing, which is what the Biden administration is signaling it's going to do. And then the military situation continues to deteriorate in the Pacific. And then we essentially have a variant of what happened to the Brits in 1967, where they were committed to the Gulf monarchies until they couldn't afford it anymore. And then they were like, we're out of here. And that is a distinct possibility. And just because Joe Biden doesn't want that to happen doesn't mean it's not going to happen. He may be forced to do it, either by dint of strategic circumstances, political circumstances, or future administrations. And a lot of this is an age issue. The people who tend to be older haven't but at some point that generation will go, and people, younger are just not, I mean, it's human nature. They tend to be more adapted, right? I mean, God willing, someday I'll run into that problem. But, that's the reality. And it's true across the political spectrum. So those are the two options. And Europe, I think, would be worse if it were a dramatic shift and Europe were not prepared. The solution for the Europeans to do what is completely, absolutely within their power to do, which is develop, a reasonable military capability to deny Russia's ability to invade and occupy territory in Eastern NATO, and maybe the Finlands and Sweden. Finland does a good job anyway. The Poles do a great job on this, and I applaud them. The Brits do a good job. The French do a pretty good job. Some of the other Norwegians and the Swedes doing better. This is well within, I mean, Europe dwarfs Russia in GDP. Now, sure, the Russians are willing to spend more, but they're not spending like the Soviets. I mean, Europe could definitely do this. And by the way, they did in the past. Most of the Western European NATO countries had very formidable militaries, less formidable than we wanted, but in the 1980s, And so what's the problem? Germany. Germany is the problem. So Germany holds in its fate and holds in its hands the future of Europe, and in some ways the future of many across the world. I find Germany's behavior bewildering, would put it nicely, but certainly not something that I would want to praise. I think they talk a lot about collective security, but their actions bespeak a profound self-regard. And okay, at this point, as Gérard Herrault, the former French ambassador to the United States, I think persuasively argued, let's just take that as a given. So if that's how Germany's going to behave, Nord Stream 2, I mean, but bigger than Nord Stream 2, not having a serious military. The West Germans, 2/3 of the current country, had 12 active divisions on the inter-German border when they were threatened. When Germany was threatened, they had a military. Now they don't have a military. So, I mean, people talk about history. Well, history wasn't such a problem in 1988 when there were still people alive who'd been in the Second World War. No, that's kind of weird. And now the people who need their help are the people who were the subject to the depredations during the Second World War. So, okay, I don't get it. Moralizing doesn't work, I guess. But what the United States has to deal with this reality. It's a recalcitrant Germany that's not willing to do it, that could easily solve the problem. I think we just need to be frank and say this is what's going to happen. We're not going to put more troops in to Europe, even with the Ukraine crisis. We'll help the Ukrainians. We'll certainly help the Poles. We'll help anybody who wants to in whatever format. But we cannot keep going on like this. And if we don't start now, it will only get worse. And so that's the model. I think it's a totally feasible model. And it's, but it's up to the Europeans. Here's the issue. A lot of Europeans think that people like me are bluffing, that at the end of the day, the Americans will always be there. Well, you could be right. Joe Biden, certainly, it's a pretty good bet with Joe Biden, President Biden. But I don't think that's a good bet in the future. I certainly don't think it's the right choice. I don't think it's the right choice for Americans. And if you're betting against Americans' long-term interests, look what happened in Afghanistan. At the end of the day, I mean, President Trump wanted to do it, but President Biden ended up pulling off the Band-Aid. I thought it was catastrophically handled, but it was the right decision. Why would you be treated differently? Yeah, NATO, okay, but I mean, if something really doesn't make sense, and just a final thought. I mean, the way I think about this is, alliances. Biden uses this term sacred. I mean, the sacred obligation that President Biden has is to Americans. They're the ones who elect him. They're the ones to whom he is accountable. And alliances are more like close business partnerships is the way I would think about it. Like I don't know, in European law, but in American law, traditionally you would have, private partnerships of banks or law firms, and the partners would hold them together. And there was a fiduciary duty. There were strong personal ties. People would play tennis or whatever. But if one of the partners was not holding up his end of the bargain, there's accountability, and it's a business relationship. And that's where we are now. And our a number of our, particularly Germany, are not. And at the end of the day, we'll need to make a decision based on what's in the best interest of Americans.
Well, indeed. I mean, many forget, for instance, that there have been 300,000 Russian, so Soviet troops actually during the Cold War in the German Democratic Republic, right, threatening directly the Federal Republic of Germany. So in a sense, nothing has changed in the Russian approach. I mean, hard power has been always part of the portfolio of threats and trying to actually gain politically by using the threat of power. What is really surprising is actually the inability of Europeans, or let's say not all of them, of course, not all European member states, but the inability to actually, well, adequately react to a threat to a threat of use of power. Do you foresee, actually, this is probably the last question related to Europe, because I see also a few questions in the chat, which I really want to address. Do you foresee the emergence of a conflictual line among the European NATO members based on the geopolitical interests of United States, China, Russia, because you mentioned Germany, but France has been, to be fair, France has been in a geopolitical rapprochement with Russia already in 2020. The French president announced many times, actually, very openly, that he doesn't see China as being a threat to Europe. So in a sense, wanted to actually engage with Russia based on French geopolitical interests, take Africa, take the Mediterranean region, and so on and so forth. Do you foresee this kind of emergence of conflictual lines among the European NATO members? Because Central and Eastern European members, as you've outlined, will never subjugate to the rule of another communist party. Right. They will always actually see Russia, and probably increasingly also China, for other reasons. I mean, for the reason of the authoritarian rule and the communist party's rule, blackmailing strategies of China. So they will actually align with the United States because they see the United States as the sole security guarantor. They don't see Germany or France as a security guarantor for their territorial integrity, for their security. And at some point, we might end up with an Anglosphere and a continental bloc of European NATO members due to their different approach to China and Russia. Do you foresee this kind of scenario?
I think it's very possible. I mean, I think NATO could end up like the Holy Roman Empire, where it's a formal shell that has some utility, but it actually conceals what's really going on, or it doesn't conceal, but it's actually happening within that formal framework. I don't think that would be good from our perspective, or even more from Europe's perspective. And so what I laid this out in a piece in International Politik, the German foreign policy journal, about a little over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. It's kind of a new bargain that, for the US, the key issue is how is Europe going to relate to China in the economic spheres? Are they going to be more aligned with us, or are they going to be kind of try to be neutralist or align, let alone align with China? And then how much of a security sort of consumer from our point of view Europe is? And on the latter, that's got to be up to Europe. But I think the new deal that I would make, because we're going to look at Europe as a broad entity based on whether it's in our interest to do so, right? So there's sort of this brain dead idea that America should always support greater European integration. And I have my own views, but I don't take a position on what Europeans' views on Eurosceptic or integrationists. That's the concern of Europeans, basically. But I do have a view on whether Europe as a cohesive entity is working with us or against us. And so the fundamental mystery of President Macron, and I really don't understand it, is that he has like a self-defeating approach, because the logical way to get more European integration is not to alienate the United States, but actually rather to try to leverage America's interest in turning to Asia to get us on board. That's the bargain, right? That's the bargain I'm laying out. Meanwhile, they're talking about a third pole. I mean, that's crazy, because it's like, oh, you're going to be a third pole. So we're going to help you unify so that you can be against us, basically, because obviously that would move away from us. No, that's crazy. Then we'll move and operate with different European countries, and the Chinese and Russians will do the same. And so Europe will become an arena of geopolitical competition rather than being covered by a kind of Europe-wide thing. So I think that what Europe should do is Germany should take leadership responsibility in a collective model within NATO, and to some extent within the European Union, for the defense of European NATO. And Americans can help with that, training, high-end capabilities, fungible capabilities, some select kind of forces, et cetera. And then we can support the European Union more and in the European Union's role, so long as Europe is, aligned. I mean, the French don't like this word, but I mean, aligned to me is kind of it's a soft word. It's not like subservient. It's basically like, look, Europe's going to look to America for generating geoeconomic scale. It's not going to try to equilibrate between the US and China. Then our incentive is going to be to operate within Europe, and same with the Chinese. So, and then, on the security front, I mean, I have tremendous sympathy for, the captive nations that are now free and deserve to be, and many of them, like Poland, deserve special applause because they really are focusing on their own defense. I think Romania as well, and to some extent the Baltics. But we're not going to be there, and I've told them this directly, we're not going to be there in sufficient capacity alone. They have to work with some other model. And I think probably working with the Scandinavians, the Brits, there's a natural alignment there. But again, the Germans are really, so I think, again, Germany has a historic decision about whether it's going to, for its own sake, but also for the sake of Europe. But of course, given its location, it's always going to affect Germany, what the overall European landscape looks like. And, this continued free riding and offloading of responsibility, which is the generous way of putting it, self-interested would be the other, will have ramifications, and we cannot keep bailing them out, basically. So, I don't think that's a good future for Europe. I think there's a natural alternative model. I wish that Paris had a different approach. I mean, I don't think the Poles and others are ever going to trust the French fully, just even from a power perspective. But if you had a model that involved the Germans, the Brits, the Scandinavians, and the American state involved on the defense side, that would be a much more credible, and that would significantly outweigh Russia, even though Russia can pack a punch because of its political culture and cohesive power structure.
Yes, I fear that if we move on, if we keep with this track, the way you outlined it, I fear that Europe is going to turn into a geopolitical background of the global affairs in the next decade, where every significant regional, not just the systemic powers, the great powers, but also regional powers such as Russia and Turkey will actually try, and maybe to some extent even Iran will actually try to capitalize on that, and will try to penetrate the geoeconomic space, use different interest groups, lobbyist groups, or minor countries to balkanize, to further balkanize the continent, and then actually build there. And we don't like this word here, but in reality, in realpolitik terms, there are already spheres of interest, whether we like it or not. And of course, they will build and will fortify their spheres of influence. So once again, because I see that the time is, we are already beyond 5. Would you have some time for a few questions from the chat? There is, for instance, a question regarding the remarks of the German Navy chief, who had to resign following his remarks in India. So what are your thoughts? Maybe you can add something. I mean, how did you anticipate the whole episode following his remarks? He had to resign because he actually stated that Putin deserves respect over Ukraine, but then again he also suggested that at some point of time Europeans would need to engage with Russia, more with Russia, in order to compete with China, similarly as the Indians would be doing. So what are your thoughts on that? This is one of the questions.
Okay. Well, I've just seen a couple of the news reports. I haven't looked at the full comments, but I mean, there's a strain of discussion that's kind of like, well, we have to understand where the Russians are coming from and what their history and what. Okay, I mean, we should understand where they're coming from for our own purposes, but that doesn't mean we give them credit for it. I mean, I don't know, the Ukrainians don't want to be taken over, so I'm not like sympathetic to the Russians on this point. I understand where they're coming from, but I'm going to look, the heuristic to look at is what is in, I mean, for me, it's in what's in my country's interest, enlightened way that is compatible with others, hopefully, of course. But, okay, yes, I know that Putin cares a lot about Prince Vladimir and, the Kiev and Rus and stuff, but okay, like, I mean, Mexico would probably like to take California and Texas back, but we're not going to give it back. So, I mean, I don't, okay. So that's kind of my, and probably military chiefs should not be commenting on sensitive political issues like that. But I mean, that's what I'd love to hear German chiefs of staff talking about would be like, it would really be the right thing for Germany to do would be to have a much more robust military capability to provide for European collective defense. It's within our ability, it's going to meet our obligations, and it's our historic responsibility given our past. That would be a nice thing to hear from a European chief instead of, oh, I feel so much sympathy for Vladimir Putin. How about some sympathy for like Poland or Ukraine or the Baltic states? That would be that would be like really great to hear. if they're going to spout off on sympathizing with other countries.
I can only recommend a piece which was written by Harold Malmgren, who actually served in several US administrations. He's a living legend in the United States. What the West gets wrong about Putin, I would really recommend everyone to read this wonderful piece of history, because he met Putin personally, and there he describes exactly Putin's Russian approach of actually dealing with everyone else by creating first and foremost problems or an environment of threats or insecurity or volatility. And once you have to deal in this kind of insecure environment and you're put under pressure and you have basically a gun put to your hand, which is now the case with Ukraine, of course, you are in an extreme situation and you have to come up with something very quickly. So in a sense, he really outlines the approach in a perfect manner, and I don't have more to add to this. There is a question about the African policy. What should be the Africa policy for the United States, or maybe for a possible cooperation between the United States and Europe in the future? And also, do you foresee a stronger or growing role for the dragon bear, that means China, Russia, in Africa? Or probably they just go separate ways and each one of them tries to to fortify or guarantee and safeguard their own national interests on the ground? China has become meanwhile trading partner number one to most of the African countries, and squeezed European powers, America, other, with a few exceptions, of course. South Africa still has some regional clout.
Well, I think for us, Africa's got to be a secondary kind of theater. I mean, certainly from a military point of view. To me, I think this would be a natural area for Europe to take the lead. I mean, probably makes more sense for the U.S. to focus on Latin America and Asia. So that would be I don't have too much else to add about that. But this is an area where I think, to the point about France, I mean, France feels a very strong connection. Italy, obviously, North Africa. So we should help them. But and we should defer to Europe, in my view, defer to European preferences on the political situation and so forth. I mean, Europe is feeling the pinch on migration and all these things. So, we don't need to be always getting our position accepted. So that's kind of my take on that.
Okay, and final question, which is related to the US foreign policy establishment.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that the foreign policy establishment will change and prioritize by its own, probably it's meant, of course, the approach to China, or will it need a bank from outside? And I would add also, because you mentioned right at the beginning, with the growing geoeconomic clout in China and in East Asia. Of course, the main reason for this geoeconomic clout was America, the way how America introduced China and connected China to all relevant US-led networks was the necessary condition. Of course, not the sufficient condition. This slide with the efforts of the country itself, But the necessary condition for China's rise will actually America become, and this will be my additional question, will become also the main reason or the necessary condition for China's demise by decoupling? And are we in fact not observing a dichotomy right now, because the US defense community, to some extent the intelligence community, the military folks, they are convinced that this is coming because they have this long-term strategic thinking. But American businesses, Wall Street, banks, investors, they are still very much on the ground. They are not convinced that actually they have to withdraw from China, right? So there is also a dichotomy because not all stakeholders are on the same page. How do they also need the bank, so to say, from outside when they realize that China pursues also national interests and will actually protect its national companies, which will be detrimental to their business interests in the long term, right? Not now.
Sure. So on the first question, I don't know. That's, I mean, essentially what I'm trying to do is to ensure that we shift before the bang, because the consequences of waiting for the bang would be grave and result in many people, I think, dying unnecessarily. So that's what I spend my time doing, trying to avoid that. There are encouraging signs, but we're not racing against ourselves. We're racing against China, and China's got a lot going for it. So, and they work hard and they're focused. So I am worried, pretty worried, very worried in some ways. Not so much that the whole will just kind of lose entirely, but that we'll be forced into a conflict we didn't need to fight that could be a lot worse, that we could lose, or something like that. But the blob is real, and its incentives are not really to think and seriously grapple with all the ramifications of where the world is going. It's much more small c conservative. I compare a lot of it to like the old Mandarin system of imperial China. The texts, you've been mentored in a certain way. There's certain schools. Often there's personal connections where you don't want to be disloyal to somebody who is your patron, or so. I don't think the blob is performing its function very well. It's basically status quo oriented, and I don't think the American people actually want the status quo. I mean, I'm a Republican, and I'm pretty convinced that that's the case among Republican voters. But I also think on the Democratic side, there's widespread dissatisfaction. So, I think it's a matter of time, but time is critical. I mean, if the British had deployed their army to Europe in June of 1914, would Germany have risked, starting a war? Quite possibly not. Europe would be in a lot better shape, probably. So, yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. To your question, Velina, the business community has a different business community. I mean, there's a lot of businesses. I mean, it depends on the business. I mean, companies that are more, industrial oriented, they know what China's up to. Bad. The companies that tend to be very pro-China are financial services, entertainment, even the technology companies. A lot of them have moved out of China, or largely moved out of China, because they see what happens. So, and I think, it's, as the communists say, it's not a coincidence, because I think Beijing has made a concerted effort to cultivate ties, particularly on Wall Street and places like that. My view is, again, it connects back to what we were talking about earlier. We don't need full-scale decoupling. We need to remove the source of leverage that would bring us to our knees, basically, and we need to restore. We need an industrial policy and so forth that restores our manufacturing base. And we screwed up big time. I think the neocons and all these people have been justly decried for their role in Iraq and ruining America's position. But the other group that hasn't is the people who just kind of threw open the door to China and didn't hold them to account on any of the things in the WTO entry, for instance. At least when they were brought into the WTO, they were supposed to change, and they didn't do anything. And so some people made a lot of money, but it wasn't net beneficial not to hold China to account. I think integrating China into the world economy was and is necessary to some extent, but we needed to have safeguards, which were supposed to be there. And that's clearly where the American public is now, I think. I mean, there are, again, it depends on who you are. Farmers, for instance, they want to export to China. But I think on the whole, people want China to be held to account and make sure that we have, yes, free, but also fair and equitable trading arrangements with China. And that's not something that's going to be probably on the table for some time, given where they're moving.
Yes, a lot of question marks at the end of this conversation, which means that we need to continue with this discussion. But also a lot of food for thought. So for all of our viewers and listeners who are interested in the American defense in the age of great power competition, buy the book of Strategy of Denial by Elbridge Colby. I suppose there is going to be another one coming out very soon. And thank you very much. Thank you very much for staying with us for actually almost 80 minutes, also for answering questions from the chat room. And well, I wish you, of course, much success with all your endeavors for the future.
Same to you. Thank you, Velina. It was a real pleasure to talk with you. So look forward to doing it again sometime.
Thank you. Thank you, Bridge.
Thank you.